I'm going to stay on this portrait image of me for the next setting, which is light. I'm also going to close down my film strip. So let's open up the light options. These are your exposure options, and you have a number of ways to adjust exposure. You have sliders that increase or decrease the exposure of every part of your image. You also have sliders down below that adjust specific parts of your image, which is usually how I like to edit my photos. Sometimes doing an overall exposure adjustment can help if something is completely underexposed. With this image, though, it's relatively well exposed. There's just parts that we can adjust to make it a little bit more contrasty and pop a little bit more. With all of these settings, or with a lot of them, you also have this auto button. Just by clicking the auto button, it will try to automatically make your photo a well-balanced, well-exposed image. And that can be a good starting point, but often it's not going to make it perfect. So let me undo that by pressing Command-Z on my keyboard. On a Mac, that'd be Control-Z on a PC. And then you also have this contrast slider. Dragging to the right makes things more contrasty, to the left, less contrasty. What that means is that increasing contrast, the darks become darker, the lights become lighter. Going less contrasty, the darks become brighter, and the highlights or the lights become darker. So you have more of a mid-range tone across your image. Let's get into these other options down here where you can pinpoint a part of your image to adjust. You have your highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. The highlights are those brighter parts of your image, which allow you to adjust just the bright parts. And you can kind of see in my hair, some of the leaves up above, decreasing the highlights brings back some of that information. The shadows, by increasing the shadows, I can bring up that exposure on my face, which was kind of dark in my opinion, so I would bring that up. The whites will be the even brighter parts of the image. So if I drag that down, I can get a little bit more information back from the background and some of these leaves in the background. See, before, after. Dragging to the right, I would increase the contrast if you want to have a very blown out background, which might be a nice stylistic approach to a photo like this. The blacks will be the darkest parts of the image, making the blacks blacker, those very dark parts of my eyes here, my shirt a little bit darker. Dragging to the right sort of washes everything out. Again, a style that you might like, but for me, I like bringing down my blacks in this image to increase the contrast. You can see the before and after quickly by hitting the backslash button on your image, and that will show the before, after, so you can see a more contrasty dynamic photo that I've adjusted. If you need to make an overall adjustment here, you can. So say it's still too dark, I can bring up the exposure here, and then maybe parts of it are too white, like my whites, so I'd bring my whites back a little bit, but now my face is a little bit brighter. So I'll usually make those sort of overall adjustments and then go back to my contrast slider to add a bit of contrast if I want. Or you also have the curve tool, the tone curve here, by clicking that button. And this brings up this line and this graph, which allows us to adjust exposure by clicking and editing parts of this line. On the bottom left, you have your shadows. Going up the line, you have your darks, then lights, and then your highlights. So clicking in the middle of this graph and dragging down, it will decrease the darks, and it also starts to affect the blacks and the lights depending on how far you go. If I click on the top part, for example, I can increase the lights. And the more I edit like this to create this S-looking shape, so look how this curve that I'm editing becomes more S-like, we're adding contrast. So you might hear that a lot with photo editing. An S-curve adds contrast. You should also see the histogram appear here, sort of in the background of this tone curve graph. This is the histogram of my image, so you can see a lot of mids, and then you also have some pure whites over here on the right-hand side. You can also use these sliders in the bottom to adjust, taking the darks, making them a little bit brighter or darker. Taking the mids, dragging to the right will make them darker, to the left will make them brighter, and same with the highlights. You can drag to the left to make everything brighter. You can turn on and off this individual tone curve here with this button right here to see what you're working on. So let's reset this by double clicking in the middle to get back to our original edit. In this tone curve window, you also have the point curve. The point curve is similar where you can create points and add contrast or adjust the exposure. But what I like about this are the black points and the white points that you see. The black point is this bottom left point. And if I click that and drag to the right, what you're telling Lightroom CC to do with this photo is to make more of this image black. If I drag to up along the left-hand side of this square, we are actually increasing the black point, so nothing is really black. What is actually black in the image becomes more gray. So if we want more of the image to become black, we just drag this to the right, and you can see as I do that, more becomes black. Similarly with the whites, if I take this top right point, drag to the left, more parts of the image become white. If I drag down the right-hand side, less becomes white, and white actually starts to become more gray. To create that sort of S-curve, I can just click in the middle and drag up and down to create that S. The cool thing too is you can go in and specifically add more points, as many as you want, to get really specific with what parts you want to increase or decrease the exposure of. You also have presets down here for the linear curve, which is your standard. You can add some medium contrast or some strong contrast quickly with those presets. Lastly, you have these individual color point curves. You have red, blue, and green. So if you take any of these, you can increase or decrease the color or the reds in your image. So if I decrease the reds, what's left are blues and greens. So if I decrease the reds and then I go to my green curve and I decrease greens, you're going to get more magenta and the blue that's left over. With the blue, you can increase the blue, you can decrease the blue to get yellow. And so this is a way that you can get really creative with the colors of your photo. You can also create sort of an S-curve with these colors to create contrast in the blues or in the reds or whatever colors you want to add more contrast to. So obviously this is a creative edit. This is not how I would personally like to edit my photos. So I'm going to set these all back to linear. For the point curve, I might go ahead and add that strong contrast back in there. And now we have this image that if we see the before and after, at least for my face, is a lot better exposed. It's definitely a style with that nice highlighted background, but it's something that I like for this image. So that's your light and exposure adjustments and how you can fix an improperly exposed image in Lightroom. Next, we're going to go back into our color and see these color mixer HSL adjustments.